In March 2011, the New York Times reported on the growing popularity of quinoa in global markets, a food fad starving quinoa growers in the Andean region of South America. The people who have cultivated quinoa for millennia can no longer afford their own diet staple, which has become an export commodity to organic health food stores in America and Europe. The people of Bolivia and Peru have turned to cheaper, unhealthier processed foods, contributing to the malnutrition already plaguing this region. Quinoa's shift in meaning, from local staple to global food trend, is on the whole detrimental to peasant populations in the Andes. This shift in meaning is compounded by shift in status. The treatment of quinoa as a new diet food in the U.S. has contributed to problems of poverty and malnutrition in the Andes, symbolic of quinoa's shift from peasant diet staple to celebrity superfood over time in changing geographical contexts. First, let's define quinoa. Often misrepresented as a grain, quinoa is a quinopod, related to beets and spinach. Quinoa has been grown in the Andean region of South America for millennia. Its unusually high protein value and balance of all essential amino acids made quinoa an ideal food to feed millions of Incan soldiers, often referred to as the mother grain in the ancient Incan language, for sustaining the Incan army in the harsh Andean altiplano. In the Incan and Andean traditions, quinoa was ground into flour for multi-purpose uses. Eventually, the nutritional values of quinoa, likened to milk by the World Health Organization, became an obsession of NASA and major researchers, turning this thousand-year-old nutrient staple in South America into an export commodity and diet food obsession in the U.S. and Europe. So what brought about quinoa's current global popularity? Knowledge of quinoa in areas outside the Andes dates to the 1800s, when German explorer Alexander von Humboldt traveled to Colombia. He observed quinoa. Quinoa was to the region what wine was to the Greeks, wheat to the Romans, and cotton to the Arabs. The difficult production process of quinoa may have initially detracted from its global uses, but mechanizing this process made it widely available. In the 1980s, American research institutions attempted to grow quinoa domestically after discovering its high nutritional value. By 1984, the United States market for quinoa symbolized $2.4 billion alone, made up of a clientele which values nutrition, is receptive to new products, and is intrigued by the unfamiliar and the exotic. U.S. crops failed to produce yields comparable to those in South America. Given the global demand for quinoa, new consumers turned to original sources. This new audience reflected quinoa's new status as a globally consumed and highly priced export commodity enjoyed by wealthy American and European health-conscious consumers. In 1993, NASA published a white paper on quinoa as a potential food for Controlled Ecological Life Support System, or CELS, launching quinoa's further popularity. NASA aimed to send quinoa with astronauts on long space missions, calling quinoa a new crop, an interesting qualifier for something that has been grown by Andean populations for thousands of years. In this context, quinoa's adoption by NASA heightened the grain's positive image, symbolic of being sold outside South America in expensive organic food stores wrapped in fancy packaging. Quinoa's popularity and global price soared, creating a problem for growers. According to the Bolivian Agricultural Ministry, quinoa prices have nearly tripled in the past 5 years, while Bolivia's consumption of this staple fell 34% over the same period. Bolivians can no longer afford the quinoa they grow, forcing them to turn to cheaper, unhealthier alternatives. While some argue that the quinoa price hike benefited growers in the Andes, quinoa production for export represents such a small percentage of Andean agriculture that the greatest impact of rising prices is the malnutrition caused by quinoa's global popularity. As of 2011, quinoa was grown on less than 2% of the total cultivated area of Bolivia. Actual yield has decreased in this region from land overuse. Quinoa farmers are selling the quinoa they grow on the market and buying products of less value, such as pasta and rice, for their own consumption. For the price of a 1,000-gram bag of quinoa in Bolivia, costing just under $5, a family can buy 4 bags of noodles or 5 bags of white rice. Unfortunately, this points to a cycle of malnutrition. As foreign demand has increased, production has not always done the same, sending prices up. This Andean diet staple has become a global commodity enjoyed by the rich at the growing expense of the poor. 2 months after reporting on the food fad starving Bolivia, the New York Times published an article on the gourmet ways to best prepare quinoa, a contradiction not to be overlooked. Unlike commodities that move from exclusive status symbol to mass-consumed food through processes of extensification and price decline, quinoa underwent the opposite. Quinoa transitioned from Andean peasant staple to global luxury item enjoyed by wealthier consumers. This transformation in meaning and status across geographical contexts also reflects change over time. In an ironic turn of events, as American consumers were encouraged to substitute pasta and rice for quinoa, farmers producing this quinoa were themselves forced to buy the unhealthy alternatives American consumers were giving up, a sad symbol of the imbalance between producers and consumers in developed versus developing nations in the global economy.